we call it analytics ready.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's analytics ready, the world is your oyster at that point. We have clients that have like 20, 25 different dashboards, and 5 of them are their most consistent decisions that they're making on a weekly, daily basis that they're referring to. The others are a variety of interesting whims and things they're curious about and things that they're making on a more of a quarterly or annual basis. But I think the pain, we talk about like seeing and visualizing your data, but the pain really is, how do I get it from in these applications to I can do anything with it? And I, have the skills and the capabilities and the technology to be able to, because, I'm not to get into AI, but like you could get it to a point where you can just go in there and say, show me my sales, quarter versus quarter. But there's a fundamental process to getting it to that point that takes time, investment, but once it's done, like you're ready.
Welcome to the How to Buy or Sell a Business Successfully podcast. The concepts discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only. No attorney-client relationship is intended or formed by this podcast. No legal advice is intended in the substance of this podcast. Feel free to check out our website, www.goforemanlaw.com. Enjoy the show and welcome your hosts, Jake Wayman and Sam Foreman.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to the How to Buy and Sell a Business Successfully podcast with Sam Foreman and I. My name is Jake Wayman, and I am the proud owner with my wife of the Orange Theory Fitness Studios here in Wichita. I also serve as a fractional business development executive. I work with companies like Infinity Capital Partners and my family's company, Citywide Facility Solutions. But the most fun thing that's happened in my life right now is my 3.5-year-old loves to sing nursery rhymes, and so right now it's a mixture of like 5 or 6 of them all jumbled together, and he'll sit there on like we have this whiteboard in our kitchen, or like where our dining room's at, where he'll just draw figurines and then he'll start singing in the middle of it, and it's hilarious. And it's like, and I'll chime in with them and he'll say, "No, Daddy, you're doing it wrong." And so I don't sing with them anymore, but that's probably the most fun that's happening in my life right now. But I'm also joined with my amazing co-host, Sam Foreman. So Sam, introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Sam Foreman. I'm the founder of Foreman Law. And I would have to say that the best thing in my life right now is this text that my wife just sent me about our 3-year-old. So speaking of 3-year-olds, and I will show this to you guys because I'm going to prove this. I've got receipts for this one. And he's holding up 3 fingers and he says, "I got $3 to buy some Bitcoin."
No.
That is awesome. That kid's going places.
Yeah. And so
ahead of the curve.
Yeah. And so for those of you that are curious about where that would come from, it's just because I am in this very brief microsecond the world's greatest dad. No, actually, it's because he watches Tuttle Twins at home. So today we are joined by our fabulous guest, Alyssa McGinn from infoFluency. And Alyssa is somebody who cares a great deal about building community and about helping business owners maximize the value of their ownership journey, from start to, transition at the other end of the funnel, and does a really great job helping educate people about the value that they can create by properly understanding their data, using their data to make better decisions with their businesses. And we're just thrilled to have her here to talk about this topic. And Alyssa, why don't you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
my name is Alyssa.
Thanks for being here.
My name is Alyssa McGinn. I am a Wichita transplant, moved here about 5 years ago. And as Sam said, I work in actually a family business. My mom and I co-own and run infoFluency. We do focus on helping companies get visibility into their data and to be able to enable strategic decisions. We really believe that at the core of every strategic direction and decision and growth is data. And so we focus heavily and specialize in the M&A sector because, whether you think you're going to sell your business or not, we want to help businesses be sellable and ready. And then along that whole M&A journey, can I add to the 3-year-olds situation? Because I'm in that world too.
Yeah.
My son is also 3.5, and his younger brother is 2. And in our house, the line is, "Mom, I have a great idea. I'm like, what is it, buddy? And it's like, I'm going to put Archie up onto the couch and throw him to the table, or like throw him and he'll stand on the table. And I'm like, I don't know if that's a great idea or a terrible idea, but basically they're scheming for these very dangerous activities. And it always starts with, Mom, I have a great idea. But I think he has an entrepreneurial bone in him because he's always has these great ideas, whether or not they're actually great ideas, to be determined.
Lean into that. I grew up with all brothers,
awesome.
and we're all 18 months apart, and we're all entrepreneurs now because we all had great ideas when we were younger.
Okay.
But we had a lot of broken bones in the process too, so just be ready for that.
I know. I haven't been to the ER.
Oh, that's
which
wonderful.
is like amazing, but I'm waiting for it.
Hopefully you will not have to encounter it. We had our youngest had C. diff. If you're familiar with that infection, it's horrifying. And we had to go to the ER and spend like 2 or 3 days in the hospital.
Oh, man.
And it was just
man.
like there is nothing as traumatizing as holding your child there while they're getting repeatedly poked to do a blood draw. I mean, it is, man. I'm not going to cry on podcasts. My mascara would run and everything. But bringing it back to M&A as opposed to drawing blood, although the M&A process can feel like drawing blood.
And it's also like raising a family too.
Yeah.
So many analogies.
We're just going to keep tying everything together. Alyssa, one of the things that we've talked to our listeners about is this idea that maximizing value is about consistently making great decisions, and that there's 3 real core components to that. Having really clear priorities of, hey, what do you want to achieve? Where are you going with all of this? Having great information, so enough of it has to be relevant, it has to be reliable, and then enough experience and expertise to understand how to apply that information to those priorities to then, complete the process of making that great decision. And when you talk about, whether it's during the ownership journey or as part of a M&A process, this idea that data drives decisions, I feel like that really reinforces this idea that information is critical to making great decisions. And that if you don't have good information, even if you know where you want to go and you've got the best team in the world, how are you supposed to make a great decision because you don't have any information to rely on?
100%. And what came to mind as you're saying that is one of our clients says it's not just about information, it's how does my information relate to my other information. And so I think that there's a process there, and there's a depth of understanding the intricacies of the different functions within your business and how certain information relates to other information, and bringing that all together. I really feel like that's where the magic happens. But there's just so many roadblocks and obstacles to doing that, especially in the types of businesses that you guys are talking about. But yeah, I mean, 100%, like data is, I say it is the foundation for strategic decision-making, but you can have decision-making based on gut or other things. It's just not going to be as reliable or trustworthy or probably get you to where you want to go because you're making decisions off of your gut. And especially when you go into an M&A transaction or think about, selling your business, that's risky. And, a lot of that process is about mitigating risk and enhancing value.
Right. I'm curious what you think about this idea that when business owners are making decisions based off of gut, what a lot of them are actually doing is tying together a lot of data points that they've observed and experienced and making a decision, applying those, but in a way that maybe they can't articulate very well or that maybe isn't very specific. Do you think that that's an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is a mixture of data points maybe they've seen in combination with their overall feel and experience of what's happening in the business. And granted, like they do have a better pulse on the business more than most people. Right. But there's a kind of a saying that's like last year's data becomes this year's assumptions. And I think that's what happens really quickly.
Like
Yeah.
Is like you're going off of something maybe you've seen or observed or just a data point your marketing person brought to you. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, actually that was 18 months ago. And I'm just assuming that now that is still true and relevant and accurate.
Yes.
And so,
yeah, it's something that we, one of our, Chris, one of our previous guests, he mentioned this. He said, pay attention to the numbers because the numbers tell a story. And I mean, I equate numbers, swap in data for that. I mean, it is. I mean, I think that's, being able to understand. I mean, you may be a great storyteller and it's through gut, but it may be through past data, but it's be able to bring that data to the table to have proof of it, because when you're in the M&A space and say you are the seller of your business, you're like, oh no, I have everything up here. It's probably because you've been looking at it, but it's be able to produce that in a way that people can tell a story, that people can see it.
And I think there's for any business owners, there's a risk in handing over your data to even an investment banker that you might work with or someone to interpret and tell the story of your business for you. And I think that's a journey that we go on with companies who are kind of in that prep to sell process is, what is the story of your business? What is the story of is that a word? Storifying.
We'll put it on this.
Storifying your revenue, your profit, your customers, your inventory. Like all of those things seem like they're just numbers, but there is a story behind that. And do you want to be in the driver's seat of telling that story and how potential buyers may look at it? Or do you want to hand over the data and let them interpret that story for themselves?
Right.
And so there's huge power in telling the story of your business with data that's relevant and up to date, and you get to be in the driver's seat of that narrative.
It's again, do you want to be the narrator or the character? I mean, you could be a character in your story, but do you want to be the narrator of your story?
Yeah, and how much of that can truly impact valuation? I think that there's there's qualitative and quantitative aspects to that, but that's a big part of it, I think, is like you're just kind of saying, okay, well, here's my business. I know my numbers are good. I know my customer base is good, but here you go. You determine what that means to you.
Yeah. Give us some examples, if you would, of how, that data tells a story in a way that helps somebody be able to support that, hey, I'm creating more value for you as a buyer, for example, that I can transfer to you now. And so as a result, there's more to be exchanged in this deal than maybe when we thought when we started.
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways that you can look at that. But I'll tell one example of a client who's in steel fabrication. And so they work in some very large industries, specifically oil and gas, and they wanted to be ahead of the game, very proactive, potentially going to sell in, up to like 3 to 5 years. So like they're kind of ahead of that curve. They were concerned that that a buyer would perceive industry concentration in oil and gas. And everyone knows that's a very volatile industry. Right. So if you're banking a whole purchase of a business on the oil and gas market, up and down and up and down,
may God have mercy on your soul. Go on.
That's risky. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, their revenue looks great. Their profit looked great. But what happens when oil and gas pulls back and stops buying or stops building rigs or whatever the case may be? So they were very proactive, and we went through their thousands and thousands of customers. The first step of that process was tagging everything by industry. And so we used an industry database and we tagged everything just to see if that was kind of an assumption. Like we feel like we're heavy in oil and gas. We need to prove that out.
Yeah.
So we proved that out, and it was actually not as bad as they thought, but there still was some concentration. They were like, buyers might be concerned about this. And so what evolved from there is, okay, we need to kind of diversify our revenue and start to understand buying patterns of our other industries. We need to start developing a sales strategy to increase the cohorts of the other industries and not just rely on this large oil and gas cohort to drive our revenue. And so I think then they have done that. Like over the past 12 months, they've implemented a very account-based sales strategy to try to really understand seasonality and to be ahead of selling into these other industries so that they can boost revenue through the other industries, not the oil and gas. And so now there's an amazing story there in their customer base and the diversification and the buying patterns and the habits of those customers and the way that their salespeople can talk about that and understand that. And, their revenue has, if you're just looking at top line revenue, like, that's increasing valuation just in and of itself, growing that top line. And then you start to put that in a dashboard and you're like, okay, we grew these, second and third customer cohorts to now that, we're not so heavy on oil and gas, and we can look at this diversified customer base, but we can also look at the diversified seasonality, if you will.
Right.
So like now we have very consistent revenue across all the months. So you start to look at that story, and I think the customer base is really where the story gets fun and interesting.
One thing, it's like I wrote down, data can challenge assumptions, and again, like it gave them you would look at this company and say, oh, you guys are only in oil and gas. But like this way, it allowed them to challenge that and realize where they are and how they can diversify. And data was allowed them to pivot, move into different industries, challenge that assumption and put more top line revenue growth on there. Because something that Chris had mentioned in our podcast was like when you have buyers and sellers, like sellers, this is like when they're going to sell their business, maybe a one-time occurrence they do this thing, where buyers are buying companies all the time. So you have a sophisticated person on this side and not so sophisticated on this thing. And if you help them with the data on the seller side, I mean, now you're making them look sophisticated, telling the story to be able to get that multiple that's a little bit higher. That could be, in excess of, a couple more $1 million in what they sell for. So like data allows them to do that.
And on the buyer side of things, you're not usually approaching the seller's data with a goal of figuring out, hey, how can I pay more for this business?
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Right.
And so when you're on the sell side, hi, by the way, I'm Captain Obvious, and this public service announcement is brought to you by, no, never mind. So on the sell side, it's your opportunity to figure out like, hey, how do I present this in a way that allows me to justify to a buyer that, hey, the value here is actually, this particular point, and I can prove it to you.
Yeah.
Because I can show all of these data points. I can show that my concentration's not overly saturated in these customer relationships or this particular industry. I can show you that I'm not a victim of seasonality. But not only that, I can also show you internal trends. Like it's not just, hey, this is what it is right now, but I can show you where the arrows are pointed. And I can show you how to understand the pipeline so that you can factor that in on things. And especially, I mean, for folks that are in a competitive, sales process, all of that data can go to work for you really hard because you've got buyers competing against each other, because they want the value that you have. And as opposed to being in sort of an isolated, one buyer sort of transaction.
Well, then kind of on the flip side though, like do you guys engage with groups that are buying companies, I assume, like more on the private equity side. I mean, now they have a portfolio of companies that they can aggregate data to as well. I mean, and so you can go into that and kind of how you work with companies. Like we're talking right now on like a sell side on an individual business owner and evaluating their data. But when it comes to like private equity, I mean, that allows them to understand how their portfolio is performing, what they can do with it and everything too. I mean, talk a little bit more on that side of how you engage with lots of data from like multiple different companies that for like a client, for an example.
Yeah, interestingly, our business started out doing venture capital portfolio analytics. And so there's just so many applications of data, but on the side you're talking about, it's looking at the portfolio performance and how is our portfolio of companies performing as a whole. Then you can start looking at, which industries are outperforming others. You can start looking at revenue growth and profit growth and churn and, customer lifetime value and how those things are evolving overarching of the whole portfolio. And that's really powerful. One interesting thing, too, that we've done for investment firms on the buying side and venture capital side is what you're kind of alluded to is like overlaying their current portfolio with deal flow and then allowing them to kind of what if scenario of, if we have this current portfolio, if we brought in this type of business or this type of business, what would that do to our overall portfolio performance? And I'm sure you guys, it's like also evaluating the platform. Like a lot of these private equity firms are doing kind of like platform plays and then doing bolt-ons or add-ons. And that's another, primed place for analysis is like what things need to be true, what criteria need to be true for these add-ons and bolt-ons to make the platform more sellable in the future. What will increase valuation in the future? Because a lot of them are pulling, 5, 6, 7 companies. They want to take it back to market as one, in 5 to 7 years. So there's kind of that aspect of it. And there's power in understanding your whole portfolio, as a whole. But then also another piece of it too on the buy side is the diligence. So there's, just the same struggles that a seller would go through of aggregating and pulling the data together. A lot of times they're not doing that and they're just giving the data to the buyers and then the buyers have to wrangle and manage. And of course they're not incentivized to find anything specific. They just want to like get it put together and understand the financials and should we buy this or should we not. And so there's a, more automated process that we've put together to pull together. We have like preset dashboards that you can put in like sales transaction and a P&L, and then you can have a report to, get the insights and analysis that whatever you want to take from that. So there's kind of those two applications on the buy side. I will say, a lot of bigger private equity, a lot of them have this in-house. And so we're kind of working with smaller micro private equity firms that don't have the capabilities.
Yeah.
But even the larger ones, they're spending, hours and hours and hours wrangling data, trying to make sense of it. It's like, but a lot's on the line too. Like there's a lot at stake on both sides. Because bad investment, bad for them, bad sale, bad for the seller. So there's a lot at stake that I think data can mitigate a lot of risk.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, when you, I think, or I guess an observation I would share is that one of the biggest values that a lot of sellers could get, especially as transactions start to get larger, from having really great data to be able to transition to the buyer, even if it doesn't affect necessarily the direct purchase price, is that a lot of transactions involve earnouts. Or other post-closing consideration. And the more you can set your buyer up for success post-closing by helping them understand, hey, here's where the trends are going, here's how the business works, all of those. I mean, it does create this virtuous cycle of I'm going to help the buyer win, and as a result, I, the sell side, am going to win as well. And I mean, from the buyer perspective, of course, having that data and knowing how to make this company successful is going to be really helpful. And real quickly, back to the gut instinct thing, because I wanted to hammer this real quickly because I think it's a good point, because it's my point, and therefore it is good to me. But I'd love your thoughts on this because you are a data professional. When business owners look at decisions and they've had a lot of success with like gut level decisions, because they've been good at observing trends and aggregating those unexpressed, unarticulated data points, I look at that and I go, okay, that's successful now, but that is not transferable and that is not scalable. Because what's between your ears as an owner isn't something that you can give to somebody unless you can translate it into data. And it's not something you can get your team to be able to do. And it's also not something that you can keep current, like what you said earlier of, last year's data becomes this year's assumptions and those kind of things. And I guess my question for you is, do you think that that's a good way of looking at it, is that if you're going to continue to rely on gut instincts, that may be successful for operational purposes right now, but it is not scalable and it is not transferable?
Yeah, I would even argue is that sustainable even if you're not going to sell your business.
Sure.
Like what do you not know?
Because there's a cap on how much you can actually absorb and function off of.
Yeah. And I think that for true like growth and strategic direction, like that isn't sustainable. But, a lot of business owners do have a lot of it in their head. And I think, the concept of people talk about when you're going to get ready to sell, like, is it owner dependent? And I think that whether or not that's applicable in different, places, like, okay, is the owner doing all the selling? Is the owner, doing all the operations? Like, I think the same thing is true here, is like, is the owner the only one that knows all the data or has a pulse on the different data pieces, whether or not that's assumption or truly data backed? Like, is it in a format that you can give to someone else? Yeah. And I think whether or not you're going to sell your business or you're just going to hand it to someone else, or you want to step out one day, or you have to step out one day. Right. Like for all of those scenarios, it's so important that whether you're a $1 million company or you're a $2 billion company, like I think it doesn't matter the size, to really have that in one simple dashboard that you could hand to someone else and say, here's the numbers you need to know for how the business is operating today and where it's going in the future. Yeah.
Is there a thing as too much data? Like, like paralysis by analysis? I mean, because there's so many data points you can pull from a business, whether it be a $2 million or a $2 billion company. It's like, how do you decipher that of like, what is the right data that we need to be putting on this dashboard? Because there's so many data points out there.
Yeah, I think it's an iterative process. If you take it all in one bite, it is probably too much. Like, what's the saying? Like, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. So that's the approach we normally take with businesses, or no matter what stage they are, is like, what's your most pressing issue? And like, what's your biggest objective? Let's datify. I'm going to use all these storify and datify. Let's put data to that first.
Alysisms.
I just add ify to everything. But let's start there.
Alyssify that.
Alyssify it. There you go. So we're going to Alyssify it.
Yeah.
Let's start there, you know? So a recent example is we do some stuff in professional services, and a lot of that has to go around people and capacity planning and, you know, how many people do I need to staff this, and how are they performing, and are they billable at this percentage, and those types of questions. It's like, that's normally the highest, you know, ROI and what's keeping them up at night. So like, let's start there, you know? And we've seen over time, like, we add on, okay, well, let's bring financials into that. Like, what revenue are your people driving to? Okay, well, let's start to understand the sales process, you know, and then we just go over time and bring in all the different business functions and start to understand it as a holistic. So I think it's really hard to just say, okay, let's implement business intelligence and just do the things, right? It's like, where are we going to start? And there has to be somewhere to start. And I'm sure, like,
right.
Same thing is true in like law or anything else. It's like, what's the number one priority? What's the most urgent thing? Let's tackle that, and then let's build off of that.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I mean, it kind of goes back to this idea that if you're going to create value, you have to make great decisions. And so, you know, at some point, the amount of data that you might have and its importance, if you can't actually apply it, you can't make a decision with it. And so the resource utilization of that, you know, of acquiring that data isn't going to be very high, because or is going to be very high relative to the value that it outputs, because you can't use it to make a decision for anything. Because your organization has only so much capacity. You only have so much capacity as a business owner to make so many decisions, because decisions use energy. And I think that's one of the other things that I think about when I think about, you know, having really good data, is that it makes your decisional velocity, you know, and volume potential that much greater as an organization, because instead of doing lots of individualized analysis on lots of different decisions, you can systematize decisions by saying, hey, we've acquired the data set, we've confirmed that it's accurate, now we know how to apply it. And a decision that might have taken, you know, somebody, you know, several hours, several days, several weeks, can be boiled down to a process that can be done very efficiently.
That's what I was going to say, efficiently. Like, I always tell people that once you can kind of do the groundwork and the hard work, and that's like just the unfun part of
I think it's fun.
Data modeling, data engineering, the architecture, the setup of it all. Like, once the data is, we call it analytics ready. Once it's analytics ready, the world is your oyster at that point. Like, you know, we can build, I mean, we have clients that have like 20, 25 different dashboards, because, you know, and 5 of them are their most consistent decisions that they're making on a weekly, daily basis that they're referring to. The others are, a variety of interesting whims and things they're curious about, and things that they're making on a more of a quarterly or annual basis. But I think the pain, we talk about like seeing and visualizing your data, but the pain really is, how do I get it from in these applications to I can do anything with it? And I, you know, have the skills and the capabilities and the technology to be able to say, because, I mean, not to get into AI, but like, you could get it to a point where you can just go in there and say, you know, show me my sales, you know, quarter versus quarter. But there's a fundamental process to getting it to that point that takes time, investment, but once it's done, like, you're ready.
Jake and Sam here. Thank you for joining us. If you find this content helpful, please like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and especially leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or iTunes. It really helps us out a lot.
Yeah, 1 star, it's on Sam.
Yeah, it's definitely on me.
How do you, like, so I'll use, like, with Orange Theory. So our franchise is very good with data. They have a lot of it, and they're doing a better job of making it very visually appealing so we can make decisions. But it's like, it can be so overwhelming, because, like, maybe you're not say you are a business owner and you love data, but you have your accounting lead or your sales executive or whoever is not. And it's like you want to be a data friendly company and you're getting all this data, but it's like it's overwhelming to them. Like how do you kind of bridge that gap between people in your own organization to, not be so afraid of the data and know how they use it effectively and make decisions off of it?
Yeah, I think that, it's a challenge. Like one, it's a culture thing. And second, I think it's just because we have all the data doesn't mean that we need to be looking at all of it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a process there that's a very consultative process, whether within the organization or outside of it, to say, what is our North Star, maybe in terms of sales, if you're talking to your sales executive, what's our North Star? What are, the big rocks or the KPIs? And let's just look at that. Because that, we can start to see very clearly, like, here's the leading and lagging indicators with our 5 KPIs we're tracking. And that's like, that equips your sales executive or, marketing lead or whoever it is they could go in there and they could say, we know that these are the 5 things that are driving sales. How are we doing on them? And I think that just simplifies it quite a bit.
Do you think it's important for folks to have a perspective that, and tell me if this sounds accurate, that when you're acquiring data, like data is not the end result you're looking for, decisions, progress is the end result. And so when you approach the engagement with somebody who's going to help you build a dashboard, who's going to help you, acquire data that's ready for decision-making support, it is to make sure that they have a plan in place for, okay, how is this going to complete the creation of value?
Yes. You have to close that loop.
Okay.
Because we can give them data all day that's beautiful and, amazing to look at. But if there's no actionable, even if it suggests actionable insight, but to your point, if there's no plan or strategy or things that are going to be enacted as a result, I would kind of go to say, why'd you go through all that effort?
Right. Like no training to say like, hey, here's how we're going to use this.
Yeah.
This is how it's going to become part of our process, part of our habits as an organization.
Well, and this is where it's thinking about in organizations today, there's like what, 3, 4, 5 generations working in a workplace right now. But so go back to our original conversation of the gut reaction. Take that gut reaction, combine it with data with that gut reaction. They could look at something, be interpreting this data, or maybe somebody was interpreting it for them, and they can say, oh, this is the decision we need to make because their gut's telling them based on what they're hearing here. And so now you bridge that divide between the two, because a lot of like in this world of, we have very data hungry, data driven, technology driven professionals and companies, but you also have on the flip side, the older generation that are anti-technology, but it's like you need both because they have the industry knowledge from being in it for so long, but then you have here so much data to make quality decisions on, but they don't have the industry knowledge to make the quality decision based on that data at hand. So it's like that's where like if you combine the two, great things can happen. Yeah.
And I think that I don't want anyone to think that I'm against like the gut feeling. Like I think that there is validity in the people that have been in the business in the industry, or even the founders, the starter of the company. Like they have insight.
Right.
I just want data to validify.
Yeah.
Did I just make up another word?
Yeah. But like to your point, though, it's like
validate.
But it's taking this because they're not going to be around forever.
Right.
They will retire. They will pass away. Is like that's the evolution of life. But like you need to take this and be able to. And how do you take that and give that to the younger generation that's coming up into the business, and that can be done through data and going through that process. So.
Yeah. I was combining verify and validate. That's what happened.
I was wrong with it. I'm curious for your take on this, just from a perspective of the role that data plays and the integration with like intuitive decision making, which I think is would be another way of describing that kind of gut feeling on things. When I think about it and I take a step back, I'm like, okay, when somebody's making that sort of gut-based decision, as opposed to like a purely analytical decision, they're not just guessing. They're not just going based off of feel. They're actually making, a very logical decision that can't necessarily be articulated and can be difficult to replicate. But they're doing it based off of information. They are doing it based off of some sort of data set that's experiential, maybe could be described as anecdotal, but they are doing it based off of data. Like it's just not data that we would consider from a traditional sense of looking at things. And that when you create a data set that has that relevant, useful information for supporting decision making, you're multiplying the power of what that person's executive function is able to achieve in that setting. Because now instead of saying, hey, I've got what I've observed or what I've heard or what I've experienced, now I've got all of these things that I can look at to make an even better decision. That I'm also able to pull in like, oh, well, that makes sense here, but I know this particular customer in this particular way. And I know that as soon as they see this particular offer, it's going to be game over and they're going to go to my competitor, because I've got these additional factors to bring in, but I do have that data set that now can make that decision making even more powerful. Do you think that that's a helpful way of looking at it or accurate, or do you think that's a Samified distortion of reality?
I think that too often the data-driven approach and the kind of maybe old way of not old way, I don't want to say that, is like the traditional way of doing it that you're talking about is the intuitive-based decision-making. Yeah. I think too often those are at odds, like they're opposing, but I think they should be integrated. Yes. So I think that, yes, what you're saying is that those intuitive decision-making approaches are not without value. Right. And they can lead to some very, customer-specific decisions that only this person knows because they have this long-standing relationship. There's some qualitative and relational pieces that data just does not acknowledge. Yeah. And that is just reality. But I just think that if we put intuitive-based decision-making into data-driven, saying it's this or this, we're missing out on a big piece of the holistic business. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of looking at it. When you think about the kinds of value that are created through data, I think a lot of people, particularly small business owners who are building a business that they hope is going to, size or value wise, make it into the middle market space. When you think about the kinds of value that is created through the use of data, I could see a lot of people going, well, hey, I'll just run my report based off of my CRM or whatever else. I feel like that misses a lot of the opportunity from using, a high quality data provider like your business.
Yeah. I think that when you're talking about value, and then maybe in terms of people truly trying to grow value, maybe to grow valuation also, you have kind of two sides of that coin is revenue and then, top line and bottom line. And so there's revenue growth. You can either grow your top line or both, minimize cost and grow your bottom line. And so I think that data provides value and insight onto both of those sides of the P&L. And so from the revenue growth perspective, a lot of what I've referred to, I think a lot of it is data-driven sales strategy, married with marketing strategy, that can drive, or even just like new approaches to market, gaining market share. Or there's a lot of intuitive and insightful ways to grow revenue through a data-driven approach. A lot of that can be very industry specific or the type of business that you're in. But we see that's often where people want to go is like, how can I grow my revenue? But on the other side, data can be very effective in reducing cost and optimizing people or inventory or vendors or suppliers, and just kind of noticing the gaps in which you're paying too much and you're just not consolidating, you're not taking the most optimal approach. And that can be a very data-driven approach too, to, being a very efficient and lean organization as you move into the middle market. So if you're kind of growing, you're looking at data, if you just want to grow value, it's like, how can I look at it? What are my revenue drivers and how can I, grow and optimize those? And then what are my biggest costs and how can I minimize those? And so I keep doing this, but really you're growing bottom line and growing top line. And I think when it comes to like truly looking at if you do want to sell, like truly looking at evaluation, there's a lot of pieces that go into that, but a lot of it's going to be revenue and EBITDA. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of like the I also got talking on that, and I kind of like forgot exactly what your question was. I heard value, and how does it kind of create full value?
And that's one of my questions was like, what measurements, like for most of your clients or your like who you would like, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like, what are the key measurements when you're looking at a data set that most people are looking at from a, venture capital, private equity? I mean, you mentioned EBITDA revenue, but I mean, are there specific measurements that they're honing in on from a data set standpoint that this is like they're zeroing right there, like the first line, the first thing they look for?
I don't know if there's like a one thing, because everyone kind of takes a different approach to it. I think, from the revenue perspective, we kind of hinted at the idea of like quality of revenue. So it's like you look at the number associated to revenue, but then I think maybe to kind of turn your question, like some missed opportunities there is like how good is that revenue? So then I think you start looking at, revenue and profit trends and how does that forecast out into the future? You start looking at revenue drivers. So like we talked about earlier, like concentration, like what products are driving revenue, what customers are driving revenue. Is there any locations or product customer mixes that you need to be looking at? So, and then I think lifetime value of a customer, that's something that can also, be really indicative of how is this revenue number driven off of one huge purchase one time and this customer left? Like starting to look at really the underlying under the belly of the revenue.
Yeah.
So like project-based versus recurring, ongoing relationship.
Wait, so you mentioned the term quality of revenue. So how does that differ from like quality of earnings, for an example? So
quality of earnings is, and I'm not a quality of earnings, specialist, but basically it's dissecting their P&L to say, all of the details about their profit and their costs and, their everything, expenses, and just like kind of detailing all of that out. What we're looking at is what's underneath the revenue and what is driving the revenue and what does the customer base look like and what do the products or services look like and, the quality of what the top line is. So it's not really qualitative, but it's a little bit more of a overarching look at what is driving the customer's revenue versus quality of earnings is more just an analytical look at the numbers.
Well, because like when you think about that as like quality of revenue, so say if it's a private equity organization buying a company, like they're looking at the quality of the revenue because they can fix the earnings side, they can fix the P&L side of it. I mean, they can go in and make efficiencies through economies of scale, back office support, those sort of things. But they need to look at how is that revenue performing and can we sustain that revenue or grow that top line revenue? We can control the bottom side of the revenue. But we need to control. We need to see if that top line is going to be able to increase and everything too. So yeah, and
there can be a lot of risk. I feel like when you maybe think that it's a growing industry that this company is in, and everything looks really good, but then you get into it and you kind of start to realize that because they could grow it significantly, but if the existing customer base and the existing revenue is not what they thought it was, you kind of have less to work with than you originally thought. And so, and some people are working off of a very specific thesis, if you will. I think that's more of a venture capital term, but maybe even in private equity, like they're working off, they want companies with super high number of customers. Or maybe the opposite is true, is like they want companies that have, maybe fewer customers, but the contract value is higher. Things like that, where it just kind of depends on what are you as a firm set up to most efficiently optimize.
Right. No, I mean, that's a great example. I mean, I'll use our industry, estate planning attorneys, for example. Many of them are set up to do a high volume of relatively low dollar value, transactions and so their business model requires kind of a certain velocity. Whereas if you were to look at, say an M&A heavy firm or, maybe even personal injury heavy firm, a lot of those are going to be reliant on, I need a larger size. And so, and then that may have certain impacts for the business model of how many resources do I need to apply to this? How do I optimize those? Do I have different, divisions in my business that work on, high volume, low margin, high velocity type items versus ones that are more, hey, this is a long arc type of a thing. And I do a very small number of really large things and, high risk, high reward kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then it starts to go to, who are they bringing in to grow the revenue, like on the marketing side? Because it's a whole different play to get tons of customers paying low dollars. Like that's a totally different marketing strategy and sales strategy than we need huge whales that are going to be with us for 5+ years.
The SeaWorld strategy.
Right.
Well, and also say it's a contract-driven organization, you need to say what's the value of that contract. It's a 10-year contract and you're 8 years in and there's only 2 years left on it. Okay, well, the value of your company is less because you only have 2 years left on that contract, or you just signed that contract and so there's a lot of value that's built into that. And so that's where, an
at-will contract that's dependent upon a particular relationship, and there's a high risk volatility.
It's going and diving into that contract saying, hey, how sticky is this contract? Does it stay? Is it transferable? Those things. I mean, and I think a lot of that is like back to your quality of revenue, what that's so critical, because it's like that's where you're just really trying to figure out is the quality of the revenue. It's like how good is it?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
And I think back to your point about we need to include contract value, because I think we do like average revenue per order. So that starts to understand like how much revenue is coming in per time that someone's purchasing something, but like average contract value, I think if you contrast that with lifetime value, you start to look at, I love matrices, but like plotting your customers on a matrix of what's the average contract value and how long do people normally stay with us and where is everyone in that life cycle? Then you start to see like, are we about to phase out? Are we gonna have to renew and like retain all of these contracts? Or do we just get a bunch of new ones and we're good for 5 more years and we can build off of that?
Because you can make a forecast when you have that information. And I mean, I think that's something I keep coming back to hearing as what you're describing about the value is that good data and a really good approach to it gives people the information that they need to make great decisions. And I mean, just hear you talk about all of these different aspects of things. I think there's so many people that just don't have this information to support their decision making. And when you don't have information to make a rational decision on stuff, then a lot of times you're just guessing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I mean, in part, that's the story of my career as a business owner is lots of guessing.
Yeah, it's real.
Which, can take you in a good direction, but it's really difficult to take you in a great direction.
It's an educated guess.
Yeah.
Sometimes educated.
And I want to say just real quickly that I think that it's not necessarily always a lack of education, but I think for a lot of business owners, even in the upper mid market, it feels unattainable. It feels like data and BI or business intelligence is like an enterprise solution.
That's for somebody else.
I can't do that. Or like even businesses that have a good amount of data think like, well, we just have like a CRM and a QuickBooks.
Right.
But it's like, I think that part of my whole mission and like the education I want to give people is, one, it's not as expensive as you think. It's not as like ridiculously like time consuming as you think. And it's totally worthwhile of an investment no matter what size of business that you are. But I think I want to bridge that gap between the middle market and like these enterprise grade solutions and help people understand that there is a way to move forward, outside of, maybe what they tout as too big for them.
Well, and you used a metaphor earlier of you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And I think some folks can think about data and integrating that into their business and go like, oh my gosh, all they think of is these massive enterprise systems rather than to use one of your illustrations earlier of, hey, what keeps you up at night? Let me help you get some data that's going to help you make really great decisions around that specific thing. And then, that's going to create value for you. And then we'll take the next thing. And then we'll take the next thing. And we'll keep just making better and better decisions over time. And, this is not a function where you go from 0 to, a million right overnight. You take it one step at a time, right?
Yeah, 100%. We talk about this this idea that it's a gateway drug. So a lot of times people
We're going to get an explicit label on this website.
We don't condone the use of drugs in this episode going on.
that I think a lot of times, like, once you taste and see your own data and just even the most simple, there's like a KPI dashboard for a business owner, it really opens their eyes, and it is a gateway drug. They become kind of like hooked on this idea of, wow, like my data, my business can tell me so much. But I think either, whatever the reason that they don't think that that's possible for them, but it really, we've seen people just get like absolutely hooked. Like, what about this? Or have you thought about this? Or can we do this? Like get really creative and innovative and out of the box thinking, which is super fun. And that's a place that you can get to, but you kind of have to take that first bite.
Well, I think people love making decisions that they feel confident about. And I think a lot of times people get stuck not making enough decisions because they're stuck because they don't have a level of confidence because they know they don't have the information that they need. And I think something you said triggered another thought that now completely escapes me. So, Jacob, please say something while I try to find that thought in my brain.
Just put me on the spot to say.
Now that I've completely derailed productivity here. Oh, I remember what it was. Okay, thank you. All right. Now I remember. When people feel like they can't access the utilization of data, and they think, oh, well, data's not for me, kind of a thing. I mean, my immediate reaction is like, but people are using data already all the time. They're just not using very much of it, or it's not very high quality, or it's not very timely, or it's not very targeted.
What do you mean they're using it all the time?
Like they'll use, well, hey, I'll just rely on my QuickBooks, or I'll just rely on this, whatever this is, but it's not something that's in a targeted fashion. It doesn't have a richness to it. It doesn't have a depth to it. And so they're just using very limited data to support decision making. And often I think people probably don't engage with it very much because they know it's not the quality that they need. I think maybe I'm off base on that.
I think you're right. I think that the most likely that the system or the application that the business owner or executive team is in most often, like QuickBooks, probably, or
QuickBooks,
CRM.
we love you. Please sponsor our show. Go on.
Yeah. Great application. But the thing is that the power comes in when you bring in the data from multiple applications. And so the business owner a lot of times is going to be looking at the data. They are looking at the data, to your point, of that one application that they're in. Maybe it is like cash flow and financials. They're going to be in QuickBooks probably every day, like monitoring that or looking at that. And so maybe it's sales and they're looking at, sales stages and they're in their CRM looking at like what's going to close or what's in proposal. So I think that a lot of times they are, to your point, looking at data, and I agree, but the depth isn't always there because those applications are siloed intentionally. So I think I wrote a post about this, like every system or application is going to tell you that they have like dashboards and analytics because they do. But that's not the holistic story of your business because you're using 6 applications and they're all telling you this, and not telling you a holistic picture. So I think they are using data, and I think you're right about that.
Well, like financial statements are a historical approach. I mean, it's inherently limited by this is the results of what occurred in the past. It's not something that's going to tell, which is useful, but only to the extent that you understand the data that went into reaching those results. And so until you can integrate that forward-looking and backward-looking sets of data, you're not going to be able to understand that well enough to go like, oh, okay, well, I didn't make enough money last year, so if I'd like to make more money this year, what I'm going to do is just stare at my P&L until it gives me the numbers that I want. No, of course not. You're going to go like, hey, well, why did those numbers end up that way? And if you don't have any data that's forward-looking, like, hey, I'm tracking how many leads calls I had, I'm tracking what kind of prospects I had, I'm tracking the deal size or whatever, then you're not going to have any information that's going to tell you, well, when this happens on the front end, this happens on the back end, and so if I want this number of result, to improve, what I need to do is I really need to figure out, use some of your examples earlier. How do I change my customer concentration? How do I, change the lifetime value of that? How to take a long-term view that aligns with, the value I'm trying to create?
Can I offer a really simple first step?
Yeah.
I think one thing that is often overlooked but very powerful is the idea of an ideal client profile. And so, a lot of people ask the question in networking conversations, like, who's your ideal client? And, people, that's very anecdotal, very assumption driven. And I think finding a data-driven ICP is something that's super powerful for growing revenue. So you start to look at, out of all of your P&L, like out of that revenue, who drove that revenue? Right. And then you kind of choose maybe the top 3 or 4, and then you break out their attributes. So like, where'd you source that client from? Were they a referral? Did they come to your website? Where'd that come from? What industry are they in? What revenue size are they? And what product or service did they buy from you? Okay, you have an ideal client profile right there. Yeah, now you go find more like them. So that gives you an industry focus, at least somewhere to start, a revenue size that's a good fit for you. And it starts to tell you, what product and service are your best client or your most high revenue producing clients buying from you. And also, like, people start to wonder about marketing. It's like, well, your best clients, like, what was the lead source on those? If it's a referral, start building your referral network, start going to referral building groups.
Ideal referral profile.
Yeah. No, that's real too. Like, where are you finding those good referral partners? And so that's a data-driven ICP that you can then replicate and build into marketing and sales.
Yeah. I know we're coming up on time, but that was a great last thing, like a step that everybody can take, even if you're not using it in the data right now. It's like, go look at your P&L and go look at your top 4 customers that drive your revenue and build an ideal client profile around them. And right there, now you can actually build some potential data points to go be driving that, because it could be if you're referral driven or if they were coming in through SEO and marketing and those sort of things. They come for their website, but really going through that, because I think it goes back to, some stuff we were talking about earlier is the data is the foundation of decision making. And right there, that's data. What you're talking about, it's like everybody's looking at data. So if you're going and doing that, you may not have a dashboard, but you're looking at it and creating it. Yeah. So
no, that's really helpful. Well, Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with folks? I loved that ideal customer profile one. I think that's the data driven. I think that's fabulous. But do you have any other last thoughts that you'd like to share with folks that you hope they'll take away from today?
I'm going to Alyssify this. Yeah.
Mic drop.
I think that my last thought is that data is only going to become more important. And for those of you that feel behind or don't know where to start, or that you're just, okay, screw it, this is not going to be for me, and I can't do it because I'm too behind the curve, it's going to be more important, and it's not too late to start. That's my last thought.
That's terrific. And the sooner you start making great decisions, the more that's going to compound the value of all the decisions that follow after that. So, Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us. I feel smarter and better educated just for having had a chance to hear you share your thoughts on things. And so thank you so much. To all of our listeners, thanks for joining us again. We wish you the greatest of success building your businesses. When you build great businesses, great things happen for you, your family, your team, your companies, and ultimately the communities that we are fortunate to call home. And so we thank you for letting us be a part of your journey, and have a wonderful, fabulous day.
Thank you for joining us today. For future episodes, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And please check out our website at www.goforemanlaw.com/learning.